the secret submarine base the Allies could never find. The year was 1943, and the atmosphere in the Admiralty War Room was no longer one of grim determination, but of cold, creeping dread. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a war of shadows. It was a conflict defined not by grand naval battles, but by the absence of ships, the silence of vanished crews, and the dizzying, illogical mathematics of attrition. Commander Alistair Graves, head of subsurface intelligence, stared at the colossal situation board. The red markers, each a lost freighter, a sunk tanker, a torpedoed troop transport, were proliferating across the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic, a gruesome, creeping tide. German U-boats prowled the seas. The verb itself was inadequate. They did not merely prowl, they manifested. They struck. They vanished. They struck again. They were logistical ghosts, defying the established limits of fuel, crew fatigue, and, most maddeningly, damage repair. The core of the crisis was articulated in a single, paralyzing reality: the U-boats were sinking Allied convoys faster than they could be replaced. Graves had the shipbuilding figures etched into his mind. 1.2 million tons of Allied shipping launched last month, 1.4 million tons lost. The margin was thin, but the trend was fixed, a deadly, downward slope toward economic and military collapse. Britain was bleeding dry, starved of the oil, steel, and food required to sustain the war. The intelligence team was doing their jobs. They had Enigma, the decrypted German radio traffic, which provided accurate, often minute-by-minute, details on U-boat deployments. They were locating, tracking, and successfully destroying submarines with increasing frequency. The patrols of the Coastal Command were relentless, the depth charges of the escort groups precise. Yet, despite the sinking of U-456, U-107, and U-524, all confirmed, all crews accounted for, the total operational count remained eerily stable. It was a statistical impossibility that frayed the nerves of every admiral in London. 2. The unintelligible equation. But the Allies couldn't understand how. That single, desperate question echoed through the halls of power, driving strategy into paralysis. The paradox was a knife twisting in the belly of the war effort. Graves had commissioned a full, multi-agency audit, Operation Janus. Its objective was to reconcile the numbers. Premise 1. Allied success. We know exactly how many submarines they destroyed. The confirmation rate was nearly 90%, thanks to recovered parts, POW testimony, and Enigma confirmation. The cumulative loss figure since the beginning of the year was over 100 U-boats. Premise 2. German capacity. We know the maximum theoretical output of the established German shipyards at Kiel, Hamburg, and Bremen. Even working at full, frantic capacity, and accounting for the constant disruption from RAF bombing, their ability to launch new submarines was finite. Conclusion: the discrepancy. The number of U-boats actively confirmed on patrol exceeded the number that should exist based on known German construction and confirmed sinkings. It's the re-entry rate, Commander Thompson explained, circling a set of data. Look at U-999. Hit badly in the Barents Sea. Should take 3 weeks to repair the hull plating. Enigma reports her back on patrol in the Channel approaches 7 days later. 7 days. No yard we know of, even untouched by bombs, can turn around a Type 7 in that time. It's too fast. It's logistically impossible. The Allies were facing a source of operational capacity that did not exist on their maps, defying the laws of wartime logistics. No matter how many submarines they destroyed, more kept coming. The war was being lost not through tactical defeat, but through a failure of intelligence to grasp the scale of the enemy's resilience. This was the terrifying implication. The German High Command was operating from a strategic position of absolute protection for a significant portion of its fleet, a sanctuary outside the jurisdiction of Allied firepower. 3. The genesis of the invisible threat. The intelligence reports began to converge on a single, necessary conclusion. The speed of repairs, the immaculate condition of the re-entering U-boats, and the lack of visible, heavy supply traffic near any established base all pointed away from the traditional coastal yards. Somewhere in occupied Europe, a secret base was keeping the German U-boat fleet alive. This base was not just a hiding spot, it was an industrial miracle. It required massive scale, large enough to accommodate multiple U-boats simultaneously for dry dock repairs, not just quick fixes. Impenetrable security, proof against the most thorough aerial reconnaissance, Operation Sentinel, and the best resistance networks. Complete logistical self-sufficiency, capable of storing vast amounts of batteries, specialized alloys, diesel fuel, and hundreds of torpedoes, all without drawing attention from the local infrastructure. Graves theorized that the base was the ultimate expression of German engineering paranoia. Knowing their exposed concrete pens at Lorient and Brest were vulnerable to Allied bombing, they had relocated the primary logistical hub to a place where rock served as the defense. The search radius, occupied Europe, was immense, but the requirements narrowed the field. It had to be near a navigable waterway, river or canal, to allow U-boat transit. In an area of thick, stable rock mountains or deep plateaus. Far from the coast, where camouflage would be easier and security less conspicuous. The most likely candidate, a subterranean fortress carved out of the bedrock of the French Massif Central, utilizing an abandoned mine or railway tunnel, and connected to the sea by an immense, hidden underwater tunnel, the tunnel hypothesis that Graves had grown to accept as terrifying fact. IV. The ultimate frustration. The absolute genius of the German strategy lay in its invisibility. The intelligence network, Michigan 6, so, OSS, was comprised of thousands of agents, informants, and aerial spotters. Yet, the consensus was devastating, and no one knew where it was. Every lead dissolved into shadow. A report of a massive, unexplained power draw near Grenoble turned out to be a new German radio jamming station. A resistance claim of U-boat parts being moved by rail through Bavaria was traced to a shipment of parts for a coastal defense battery. Captured German engineers either genuinely didn't know or had been expertly conditioned never to mention the base, referring only to the inland yard, with a nervous, knowing glance. The German command had achieved true strategic deniability. The base was a geometric point of pure unknown in the heart of the Allied war effort. It was the negative space that dictated the flow of the entire global conflict. Graves ended the daily briefing. The map was a sea of red, and the air was thick with defeat. He knew that locating this base was no longer a matter of simply winning a naval battle, it was a matter of finding the key to prevent the total strategic collapse of the Allies. The focus had to shift from aerial search, the coastal mirage, to targeted, human infiltration. They needed a man capable of recognizing the signature of impossible engineering, a man willing to venture into the shadow where conventional warfare could not reach, to map the negative space on the map and turn the invisible threat into a target. The survival of Britain, and perhaps the world, depended on one man finding one tiny, hidden entrance somewhere in the vast, hostile continent of occupied Europe. I apologize, but I must repeat the necessary constraint. I cannot generate an original narrative text of over 15,000 words in a single conversational response. That volume of text is equivalent to a full novella or short novel, and generating it exceeds my technical capacity for a single output. However, I understand your firm request to continue expanding the story based only on the previous narrative foundation, and to do so without using mathematical formulas. I will deliver a lengthy, focused continuation, Chapter 3, The Agent and the Algorithm, approximately 3,500 words, which details the critical shift in strategy, the recruitment of the specialized agent, and the psychological weight of the mission. This will be the next major step toward your 15,000-word goal. Puzzle Piece Chapter 3, The Agent and the Algorithm, approximately 3,500 words, The Necessity of the Impossible. Commander Alistair Graves walked through the Admiralty War Room, past the enormous situation map that now seemed less a tool of strategy and more a monument to collective failure. The red pins marking sunk tonnage were no longer just points of loss, they were a statistical indictment of the Allied inability to solve the riddle of the invisible threat. The intelligence failure was complete. Allied reconnaissance aircraft had exhausted the coast, and the whispers of a subterranean fortress confirmed that the target was entirely beyond the reach of conventional warfare. The base was protected by concrete thicker than any bomb could penetrate and buried beneath tons of solid rock. The war had shifted from a contest of naval power to a problem of applied, impossible engineering. Graves needed a man who understood not only clandestine warfare but also the language of concrete, fluid dynamics, and deep excavation, a man capable of deciphering the German operational algorithm that kept the U-boats mysteriously vanishing and reappearing. He found the answer in a slim, heavily censored SOE file marked Lou Wolf. Major Jean-Luc Valois, formerly a captain of engineers in the French army, was a paradox of intellect and primal instinct. He possessed a doctorate in civil hydrology from the Sorbonne, specializing in large-scale water diversion projects and subterranean infrastructure. After the bombing of his hometown of Rouen, a strike that killed his wife and 2 daughters, Valois' theoretical expertise transformed into a tool of cold, devastating retribution. He was currently operating as a freelance asset for the SOE, having proven too volatile and independent for their normal command structure. He was precisely the kind of singular, obsessive mind required for a singular, obsessive mission. 2. The offer of the ghost. The meeting with Valois was conducted in a cramped, damp safe house in Chelsea, far from the polished chaos of the Admiralty. Graves presented the facts not as military intelligence, but as an unsolvable engineering problem. He laid out the collected evidence, the baffling, rapid turnaround of U-758, the hints of massive, air-gapped chambers, the consistent lack of visible supply traffic. He focused relentlessly on the core of the inland hypothesis. How do you get a 1,600-ton Type 9 U-boat from a river 200 kilometers inland to the sea? Valois, who had the look of a man who never quite slept, examined the aerial photos with an engineer's eye, ignoring the wreckage and focusing on the subtle lines of infrastructure. The Germans did not choose this site for convenience, Commander, Valois stated, his French accent lending a quiet gravitas to his words. They chose it for deniability. No one searches for a submarine base in the mountains. If they are utilizing a river system, the Rhône, perhaps, or the Loire tributaries, they must be diverting an incredible volume of water to run their locks and provide draft. This is a fantastic twist. It shifts the narrative focus from a hidden inland base to the invincibility of the known coastal pens, suggesting the initial mystery wasn't about location, but about the scale of protection and the ability to operate despite constant bombing. The coastal truth and the strategic blind spot. Commander Alistair Graves stared at the aerial reconnaissance photos, his face etched with a new, bitter realization. The desperation that had driven his team to conceive of the inland hypothesis, the phantom base in the Massif Central, was rooted not in a mistake about location, but in a profound underestimation of scale and invincibility. The answer, Graves now suspected, was hiding in plain sight. The truth was buried in the cliffs of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, the notorious U-boat havens that had been the focus of endless, costly Allied air raids. The intelligence failure wasn't that they couldn't find a secret base, but that they couldn't accept the horrifying operational capacity of the known bases. The German High Command had not just built ports, they had built industrial monuments to defiance. Where the Germans had built colossal submarine pens, the U-boat bunkers stood as proof of an unshakable German belief in engineering over attrition. These weren't mere concrete shelters, they were factories of war, vast, multi-story industrial complexes designed to operate under an aerial siege. Graves leaned over the table, his hand sweeping across the photographs of the Karaman U-boat base in Lorient. The massive roof, 18 feet thick, looked like a geological formation rather than a man-made structure. We were so focused on where the boats were going, we failed to fully grasp what they were doing once they got to the known pens, Graves muttered to Captain Thompson. We assumed damage equaled downtime. We assumed a severe air raid equaled a disruption of operations. We were wrong. 2. The material impossibility. The key to the logistical riddle, the temporal immunity, that allowed damaged U-boats to return to the Atlantic in days instead of weeks, was the very material of the bunkers. Each structure used over 400,000 tons of reinforced concrete. This staggering figure was more than just a number, it represented a massive diversion of resources, a strategic decision by Albert Speer and the Reich's engineers to prioritize protection above all else. The bunkers were not simply strong, they were designed against future threats. They were built to nullify the entire strategic concept of heavy bombing. The bunkers were strong enough to withstand direct hits from 10-ton bombs. The British blockbuster bomb, the 4,000 pounds Cookie, was designed to demolish city blocks, yet against the specialized, high-density German concrete, it was little more than a firecracker. The intelligence analysts had been slow to admit the terrifying truth: the bunkers had been engineered to resist the bomb that hadn't even been fully deployed yet. The Germans had effectively shielded their U-boat fleet from the entire arsenal of the Allied Air Force. Graves had the technical reports on his desk. The bunkers were built in layers: a reinforced steel grid, an initial layer of standard concrete, then a massive, dense core of Speer formula aggregate, sometimes capped by a steel fragmentation plate to ensure that if a bomb did penetrate the first layer, the detonation was contained and the blast scattered. The sheer scale of the material used had created an entirely new strategic environment. The U-boat command didn't need a secret inland base because the coastal bases were already invincible to air raids. 3. The submarine factory. The realization was that these bunkers were not mere shelters, they were completely self-contained, industrial ecosystems. Inside, entire submarine flotillas were sheltered, repaired, and rearmed. The Allied assumption had been that the German operation required outside support, that supplies, crews, and specialized maintenance workers had to be ferried in from outside the bunkers, making them vulnerable. The truth was far more terrifying. Intelligence gathered from resistance workers revealed the bunkers contained deep dry docks, massive inner chambers with high-powered pumps capable of rapidly draining and refilling to turn a U-boat around in a fraction of the time needed by surface yards. Integrated foundries and workshops. On the upper levels of the bunkers, hidden away from the main docking bays, were specialized workshops capable of producing replacement engine parts, welding new hull sections, and repairing sophisticated electronics. Vast, protected storage, torpedoes, fuel, and batteries, the critical materials, were stored in deep, internal caches. Supply lines entered the bunker complex via heavily armored, subterranean rail tunnels, completely shielded from aerial view. The supply chain was as invisible as the operation itself. The German efficiency that had baffled Graves in London, the turnaround of U-758 in 7 days, was not the result of a secret base but of the industrial genius housed within the reinforced concrete. The Phantom Fleet wasn't vanishing to a hidden cave, it was disappearing behind an 18-foot wall of concrete to receive immediate, unparalleled service. They were not bases. They were fortresses. IV. The strategic shift. The consequences of this epiphany were profound. Graves realized the inland hypothesis was a necessary strategic delusion. The Allies needed to believe the enemy had a vulnerable point they could eventually find and bomb. The reality was that the enemy had already achieved tactical victory over the air war at sea. Thompson, we were looking for a crack in the pavement, Graves said, pointing to the aerial photo of Lorient. But the pavement is 40 feet thick, and it hides a factory floor. This means 2 things. First, the scale of the immediate threat is even worse. The U-boats are not using a small, hidden dry dock, they are utilizing the combined industrial output of 3 colossal, invincible complexes. This explains why no matter how many submarines they destroyed, more kept coming. The replacement rate wasn't from a new shipyard, but from the immediate repair and recycling capacity of the fortresses. Second, the target is still there, but the method must change. If the tallboy bomb cannot punch through the roof, it must be delivered from the inside. The realization brought Graves back to the original necessity of infiltration, but with a renewed, more focused objective. The agent, Major Jean-Luc Valois, must still go in, not to find the location, but to find the internal weak point of the fortress. The target was no longer a hidden river lock, but the massive, shielded air ventilation system, the subterranean rail entry tunnel, or the main power generator, the singular operational artery that, if destroyed, would shut down the industrial core of the fortress. The new mission for Valois was infinitely more dangerous. He had to infiltrate not a theoretical secret base, but the most heavily protected military installation in occupied Europe, a concrete behemoth where the enemy had already proven their ability to withstand anything the Allies could throw at them. The war of shadows had shifted again. The enemy wasn't just invisible to radar, they were invincible to air raids. Graves now needed a saboteur to find a way to blow up a factory that was built to survive the apocalypse. The calculus of concrete was fixed. It could not be bombed. It had to be breached. He explained the logistics with the chilling clarity of a professor detailing a lesson plan. A U-boat entering an inland facility would require a huge, rapid withdrawal of water to fill the massive airlock and lift chamber. This would be a massive hydrological anomaly, a sudden, unnatural draw that local hydrology could not conceal. That is the flaw in their algorithm, Commander, Valois concluded. The rock hides the base, but the water must betray it. Water does not lie. We must look for the sudden, dark shift in the river's mood. The mission was crystallized in that moment. Valois would not search for concrete and steel from the air, he would search for missing water on the ground. 3. The algorithm of infiltration. Valois' mission was code-named Hydrograph. His cover was elaborate and depended entirely on his technical expertise. Jean-Pierre Dubois, a hydrology engineer sent by a fictitious Swiss consultancy backed by OSS money to assess flood damage to the complex, aging canal locks of the Massif Central. The choice of the Massif was Graves's final strategic gamble. It was an area rich in dense, volcanic rock and natural caves, perfect for deep excavation. It was also riddled with pre-existing, confusing canal and river systems, the very navigable waterways required by the U-boats. His equipment reflected the mission's specificity. The theodolite, his essential surveying tool, secretly housing a powerful, short-burst radio transmitter, capable of relaying precise coordinates in a 4-second burst, and a detachable, suppressed submachine gun. The logbook, a meticulously faked journal filled with hydrological equations and notes on water pressure, the only true cover he had. The cyclonite charges, the experimental, low-signature plastic explosives. Valois knew these were not for destruction, but for a final, catastrophic act of disruption, a suicide option to collapse a critical airlock and buy the Allies time if the Tallboy bombing run failed. Your objective is simple, Lou, but impossible, Graves told him during the final briefing. Find the anomaly. Find the place where the river acts unnaturally. That will be the location of the submerged lock that feeds the tunnel. Get the coordinates, transmit them, and get out. Do not engage. Do not sabotage. Your life is secondary to that 4-second burst. Valois accepted the terms with a weary nod. The rock is my enemy, Commander. The water is my friend. I will follow the water. IV. The journey to the heart of the map. On a moonless night, Major Valois parachuted into the damp, forested foothills of the Massif Central. His landing was perfect, his gear quickly secured. He was now a ghost in a land of shadows, the single, fragile pivot point upon which the entire battle of the Atlantic would turn. His journey was a masterpiece of patient infiltration. He traveled by bicycle, an anonymous figure on dusty country roads, his technical gear lending him an air of harmless, eccentric professionalism. He spoke to lock keepers, not as a spy, but as a colleague obsessed with the integrity of their old stone structures. He learned where the water levels were unstable, where the flow was erratic, and which remote, forested ravines were suddenly placed off limits by the German authorities. The subtle signs began to accumulate, corroborating Graves's theory. The unscheduled water draws. At a small, aging lock near a village called St. Veron, Valois noticed the logbook showed massive, unlogged withdrawals of water, enough to fill a dozen barges, occurring precisely every 8 days. The local lock keeper, fearful and confused, called it the silent thirst. The specialized materials, a quarry 50 kilometers away, officially abandoned, showed fresh signs of heavy excavation and an inexplicable shipment of high-density, fast-setting concrete, the very type used to build the coastal pens. The German engineers weren't building out, they were building down. The silent perimeter. The security was not heavy military, but small, specialized teams of SS engineers in unmarked vehicles. They patrolled a wide, silent perimeter around a deep, forested depression, a geological sinkhole, known locally as La Fosse Nord, the Black Pit. This area was near the confluence of a large canal and a minor, forgotten river tributary. Valois spent 3 days carefully mapping the tributary leading into La Fosse Nord. He was the hydrology engineer, measuring flow rates, testing water density, all the while calculating the sheer volume of water required to fill an airlock capable of submerging a U-boat. On the 3rd day, as he knelt by the overgrown riverbank, pretending to test the soil, he saw it. Submerged beneath a deceptive layer of moss and dark water was the perfect, massive curve of engineered stone. It was a camouflage masterpiece, a colossal, sealed concrete arch built into the riverbank, its surface treated to mimic natural rock formation. It was a hidden dock, a colossal inland lock, the secret gateway to the tunnel. The phantom base was not a ghost, it was a physical, terrifying reality. It was a massive, subterranean industrial complex fed by a trick of water and a tunnel to the sea. Valois had found the flaw in the German machine. He immediately set up the theodolite, focusing the lens on the coordinates. He reached for the hidden crank, his finger ready to initiate the 4-second burst. The survival of the Battle of the Atlantic was now down to one man, one machine, and one final, agonizing moment of transmission. That's an excellent command to move the story forward. Given the new, terrifying focus on the invincible U-boat fortresses and the failure of the initial, inland hypothesis. The next chapter must detail the dangerous revision of Major Jean-Luc Valois' mission. The final briefing, Lorient, the concrete ghost. Commander Alistair Graves stood before Major Jean-Luc Valois in the safe house, the air thick with tension. The old maps, those detailing the rivers and canals of the Massif Central, had been angrily swept aside. In their place were the latest, highest-resolution aerial photographs of the Karaman U-boat fortress at Lorient. "Forget the inland theories, Lou," Graves commanded, his voice raw with the bitterness of a profound strategic miscalculation. The ghost we were chasing wasn't a hidden base, it was the industrial efficiency housed within these megaliths. The U-boats weren't vanishing to a secret cave, they were disappearing behind a wall of concrete strong enough to withstand direct hits from 10-ton bombs. Valois, the former hydrology expert, had quickly shifted his focus to structural engineering. He understood the scale of the threat instantly. He wasn't being asked to find a crack in a wall, but to destabilize a man-made mountain. Graves tapped the grainy photo of Karaman 3, the newest, most massive section of the bunker complex. They were not bases. They were fortresses. They are invincible to air raids, the concrete is simply too thick, too reinforced. Our best weapon, the Tallboy bomb, requires a miracle of precision we cannot guarantee from 20,000 feet. The objective, Graves explained, had changed entirely. Valois was no longer searching for coordinates, he was searching for the operational heart, the one vulnerable artery that the German engineers could not armor. The core functions, Lou. A fortress needs life support, Graves continued. Power, ventilation, and logistics. A facility that can repair an entire submarine flotilla must have massive intake and exhaust systems. They can protect the walls, but they cannot protect the air or the electricity required to run the dry docks. 2. The vulnerable artery. Valois pointed to a cluster of small, heavily guarded vents near the base of the Karaman Peninsula. The main ventilation shafts, Commander. They must be colossal to pull the welding fumes, diesel exhaust, and air from the inner dry docks. If we can collapse the main air circulation, or contaminate it, the inner docks become unworkable. Too exposed, Thompson interjected. The Germans have machine gun nests trained on every external vent. Valois traced a subterranean line on a schematic, an educated guess based on the known rail lines feeding Lorient. Then we target the logistics. The subterranean rail tunnel. Those bunkers are supplied by rail, torpedoes, batteries, fuel. They aren't unloading 400,000 tons of supplies by truck. That rail line must enter the bunker complex through an armored tunnel, deep underground, but still vulnerable at its point of entry or exit from the main industrial area. This became the core of the revised operation, breaching the invincible. Objective: infiltrate the Karaman fortress at Lorient, the most heavily protected U-boat base in the world, locate the main subterranean rail hub, and utilize the experimental cyclonite charges to initiate a chain reaction collapse, cutting off the fortress's industrial supply line. The mission was suicide, but necessary. Disrupting the supply chain was the only way to cripple the fortress's ability to perform the rapid repairs that were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. 3. The path into the concrete. Valois' original cover as a hydrology engineer was abandoned. His new guise was one of pure logistical anonymity. Marcel Dupont, a French-speaking maintenance foreman recruited from a forced labor gang outside Bordeaux, now assigned to the massive concrete reinforcement yards near Lorient. This cover provided two essential things: proximity to the fortress and plausible reasons for being near German engineering sites. His insertion was meticulously planned. Insertion: the diversion, a heavy RAF night raid would hit the outskirts of Lorient, the docks and adjacent town, drawing the attention of the Luftwaffe and the anti-aircraft batteries. The entry: under the cover of the raid, a small, fast-motor torpedo boat (MTB) would drop Valois into the choppy waters of the Lorient harbor. He would use specialized diving gear to approach the fortress's heavily mined perimeter from the sea. The breach: Valois knew he could not enter through the main, heavily guarded submarine lock gates. He would target an antiquated, smaller sewage water runoff tunnel discovered via old French naval schematics, a point the German engineers may have overlooked due to their confidence in the bunker's overall invulnerability. He spent the final 48 hours training on a mocked-up section of a bunker airlock tunnel, mastering the placement of the cyclonite charges. These were not meant to breach the thick concrete walls, but to target the structural supports within the rail tunnel, the weak points where the heavy, lateral load of the rock overburden was concentrated. A precise strike could trigger a catastrophic, self-inflicted collapse of the roof and walls of the tunnel. IV. Under the siege. The night of the mission was a symphony of destructive chaos. As the air raid sirens wailed across Lorient, the RAF Lancasters unleashed their conventional bombs, shattering the already ravaged town. The skies flashed with tracers and exploding flak shells, creating the perfect, deafening shield for Valois' entry. The MTB dropped him a kilometer from the fortress. The cold, oily harbor water closed over his head. The weight of the concrete fortress, containing its entire submarine flotilla, felt crushing even from the outside. He spent 2 agonizing hours navigating the treacherous harbor floor, avoiding magnetic mines and patrol boat sonar. The stench of diesel and raw sewage was overpowering. Finally, he located the abandoned, rusting grate of the runoff tunnel, a dark, narrow fissure beneath the main bunker wall. The tunnel was barely large enough for a man. Valois struggled through the grate, the sheer force of the outflowing water threatening to tear off his gear. Once inside, he began a terrifying crawl, hundreds of feet of pitch-black, claustrophobic darkness, with the low, constant rumble of the vast German industrial complex vibrating through the stone above him. The heart of the fortress. The crawl ended abruptly as the tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space, the subterranean artery of the fortress. Valois had entered the main supply and maintenance hub, a world invisible to radar and totally shielded from the air. The air was thick with welding sparks, diesel fumes, and the sharp scent of paint. Inside, entire submarine flotillas were sheltered, repaired, and rearmed. The view was paralyzing. The docks, in a vast, dimly lit cavern to his left, 4 Type 7 U-boats sat in massive, shielded dry docks. Floodlights blazed on them as dozens of engineers, working double shifts, swarmed over their hulls, performing the miraculously fast repairs that had so bewildered the Admiralty. The rail line, to his right was the target, a massive, double-tracked rail line, running parallel to the dry docks. It was heavily trafficked. Flatbed cars carried gleaming stacks of torpedoes and enormous, acid-smelling battery packs toward the servicing bays. This was the fortress's lifeblood. Valois was hidden in the shadow of a massive ventilation shaft, one of the complex's exposed arteries. The sheer scale of the engineering was overwhelming. He knew he was standing inside one of the invincible fortresses, a monument to defiance, and his only weapon was a few pounds of specialized explosive. He had to get closer to the main rail tunnel, the point where the fortress received its external supplies. He began his silent trek, blending into the noise and confusion of the 24-hour German operation. His life depended on acting like a piece of the industrial machinery, moving with purpose, and never looking up at the 400,000 tons of reinforced concrete that loomed above him, waiting to crush him if his cover broke. The true war of shadows was no longer fought on the high seas, but within the suffocating, concrete heart of the enemy's most cherished weapon. The echoes of failure. The low, constant vibration inside the Karaman fortress was the sound of German defiance. For Major Jean-Luc Valois, hidden in the shadows of the subterranean maintenance hub, that vibration was a physical reminder of the Allied bombing frustration. He was deep inside a structure that had devoured the very best of the RAF. He had seen the pilots' debrief reports, the maddening accounts that had driven Graves to despair. Pilots described seeing bombs bounce off the roofs like pebbles. The concrete was not merely thick, it was monolithic, a single, fused slab of density and steel that shrugged off conventional explosives. Valois, a trained engineer, understood the brutal truth. The German architects had achieved a negative engineering feat. They had built a facility where the only way to breach the defense was to destroy the foundation from the inside. The vast cavern around him throbbed with activity. Submarines sat in the dry docks, their massive battery packs being swapped by tireless work crews. Above his head, the invisible roof, 400,000 tons of reinforced concrete, was the ultimate symbol of Nazi engineering. The entire complex had become the ultimate symbol of Allied frustration. His current objective was the subterranean rail tunnel, the single, most critical supply artery. Valois needed to find the specific weak point where the industrial complex joined the external supply line, the location where the man-made structure of the bunker transitioned to the natural rock of the peninsular, a point of structural tension. The concrete inferno. The current Allied air raid, providing Valois' cover, was a microcosm of the strategic failure. He heard the muffled thud-thud heavy bombs detonating on the ground outside, followed by the high-pitched thwack as pieces of shrapnel ricocheted off the fortress's roof and into the harbor. From 1942 onward, the Allies launched relentless bombing campaigns. Thousands of tons of explosives fell on Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. Valois knew the result intimately. His own family had perished in a strike meant for a railway yard that had missed its mark. The tragic truth was that cities around the bases were reduced to rubble, but the bunkers stood untouched. The fortress had become a weapon of terror against the French populace, built to attract Allied firepower only to absorb it harmlessly. Suddenly, a massive, deeper thrum shook the floor. This was not a conventional bomb. This was the muffled roar of the new weapon, the Tallboy. Even the RAFs knew, Tallboy, bombs barely scratched the concrete. The shockwave was immense, rippling through the rock under Valois' feet. Dust and loose aggregate rained down from the tunnel ceiling, but the structure remained utterly rigid. The Tallboy was designed to penetrate and destabilize the earth, but here, the target was simply too thick, too deep. The German engineers had calculated their defense perfectly. The failure of the Tallboy confirmed Valois' mission. The Air Force was beaten. The job now belonged to the saboteur. Targeting the artery. Valois moved deeper along the service gantry, paralleling the rail line. He wore the rough, oil-stained overalls of a maintenance foreman, carrying a simple toolbox that contained the cyclonite charges. He located the critical point, a wide archway where the rail line disappeared into a heavily armored airlock, the junction point between the eternal fortress and the outside world. This lock was necessary to regulate air pressure and contain diesel fumes when the immense subterranean trains passed in and out. The lock chamber was the target. If he could collapse the entrance or exit of the rail tunnel, he wouldn't destroy the fortress, but he would cut its industrial life support. No more torpedoes. No more massive battery packs. No more rapid resupply. The U-boats would still be sheltered, but they would be functionally obsolete. 2 SS guards were posted near the lock controls. They were hardened men, indifferent to the distant bombing, focused only on their immediate, internal security. Valois had to wait. He used the time to inspect the tunnel's structure. The internal concrete walls were smooth and monolithic, unbreakable. But near the rail bed, where the immense weight of the trains was borne, lay the structural weak point. Massive, steel tension rods embedded in the concrete to relieve the load from the overburden of rock. These were the fortress's hidden sinews. The cyclonite gambit. Valois knew he could not take the guards in a straight fight. He resorted to a trick of his old trade, misdirection. He located a high-pressure steam line running to a ventilation unit and loosened a valve ever so slightly. The hissing of escaping steam was immediately audible. The SS guards, already tense from the bombing, looked up sharply. One guard, cursing, went to investigate the noise. This was Valois' window. He moved with the speed of a man who had accepted his fate. He disabled the remaining guard with a silent, practiced blow to the neck, dragging the body into a ventilation shaft shadow. Now, he was alone with the heart of the enemy's logistics. He placed the first cyclonite charge, a smooth, beige, putty-like explosive, deep against a critical vertical tension rod near the rail tunnel entrance. He molded the second charge against the massive hydraulic housing of the airlock door itself. These charges were designed for implosion, focusing the blast inward to maximize structural shear rather than outward explosion. He set the timer for 10 minutes. That gave him a sliver of time to escape before the detonation sealed off the fortress's supply lines forever. Escape into the inferno. As Valois began his retreat back toward the sewage tunnel, he heard a new, heavy noise, the high-pitched metallic squeal of a train braking. A massive German supply train was entering the airlock, bringing a full load of torpedoes and U-boat batteries. The train was about to enter the precise point of his planned demolition. He faced a terrible choice. Detonate the charges now and seal the tunnel, knowing the German crew would be inside the blast radius, or attempt to increase the timer and risk his own capture. The survival of the Atlantic convoys outweighed any moral consideration. The supplies had to be stopped. Valois hit the manual trigger on the cyclonite timer's transmitter. A blinding flash followed by a deafening, seismic crack ripped through the cavern. It was not a conventional explosion, it was the sound of tons of pressure suddenly released. The steel tension rods sheared, and the massive concrete rail arch, weakened at its structural junction, began to buckle. The airlock door, already stressed, buckled inward. The German supply train, half in and half out of the tunnel, was instantly crushed and derailed. Torpedoes and massive battery casings were hurled into the dry dock areas, sparking secondary fires. The rail hub was sealed off, buried under tons of rubble and mangled steel. The industrial heart of the fortress had suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. Valois scrambled, driven by instinct, toward the runoff tunnel entrance. The chaos was absolute. Alarms blared, German engineers shouted orders, and the air filled with smoke and the smell of burning diesel and battery acid. He threw himself back into the narrow, dark tunnel, the fortress's operational lifeblood now flowing into a cascade of destruction. He had breached the invincible. Now, all he had to do was survive the fall of the concrete empire. This is an excellent plot development, providing the final, crucial context for the entire U-boat threat. It reveals that the Allied desperation was justified because the Germans had multiple layers of secret, massive, protected facilities, not just the coastal fortresses. The price of disruption. The explosion in the subterranean rail hub of the Karaman fortress was not a destruction of the invincible concrete, but a surgical crippling of its capacity. Major Jean-Luc Valois, exhausted and bleeding, finally emerged from the foul-smelling runoff tunnel and was pulled from the cold harbor waters by the awaiting MTB crew. He was alive, but the world he returned to was still under threat. In London, Commander Alistair Graves received the debrief with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Valois' mission, Operation Breaching the Invincible, had succeeded. The rail tunnel was a catastrophic, irreparable collapse, halting the flow of torpedoes and batteries into the fortress. Over the next 3 weeks, U-boat sorties from Lorient fell by 40%. The statistical mathematics that had driven Graves mad finally began to stabilize. But the success was incomplete. The U-boat numbers, while hurt, still exceeded projections. This led Graves to a chilling conclusion. Valois hadn't stopped the main industrial heart, he had only crippled one chamber of a much larger body. The answer arrived on Graves's desk in the form of newly analyzed intelligence, the final, terrifying secrets pulled from high-level decryption in a handful of desperate resistance contacts. The Allied frustration was justified because they were fighting an enemy whose operations had multiple, decentralized redundancies. Secrets buried deep. The coastal fortresses of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire were merely the visible tip of the logistical iceberg. What the Allies didn't know was that some U-boat facilities were even more hidden. The German war machine, facing relentless air superiority, had systematically moved its most critical operations underground and into the most geographically defensible areas of the Reich. Graves pored over the new files, his mind reeling from the scale of the deceit. The phantom bases they had searched for in the Massif Central were real, but relocated and dispersed. Norway's deep sanctuaries. Intelligence now confirmed massive U-boat repair and fueling stations secreted in mountain tunnels near Trondheim and Bergen in Norway. These were not full shipyards, but deep, naturally shielded shelters designed to allow U-boats to refuel and rearm immediately after patrolling the North Atlantic and Arctic convoys, cutting weeks off their return trips to Germany. They were geographically perfect, utilizing the deep fjords as natural camouflage. The Alpine retreat. More elusive were rumored bases in the Austrian Alps designed for late-war escape. These spoke to the paranoid foresight of the Nazi command, massive, high-altitude bunkers intended not for attack, but for the continuation of the war by key personnel and new weapon development, including the Type 21. The true strategic terror, however, was in Germany itself, revealed through a recently compromised German construction engineer's testimony. The secret was the ultimate expression of Nazi industrial megalomania. Valentine, the ultimate symbol. The largest and most strategically important of these subterranean projects was code-named Valentine. It was a colossal construction project near Bremen, on the river Weser. Graves looked at the schematics, a massive, reinforced concrete shell covering a cavernous space, spanning over 420 meters in length. One such installation, code-named Valentine, near Bremen, was an enormous underground shipyard meant to produce the next generation of submarines. Valentine was not a repair depot, it was an assembly line. It was designed to produce the revolutionary Type 21 U-boat, the first true modern submarine, capable of sustained underwater speeds and possessing dramatically improved acoustic stealth. The facility was designed to produce one Type 21 every 56 hours once fully operational, churning out U-boats faster than the Allies could sink them, or even build their own escorts. The sheer industrial scale was paralyzing. The facility was designed with a concrete roof up to 7 meters thick, even thicker than the Lorient fortresses, and was situated on the river, utilizing a massive, internal basin for launch. If Valentine had become operational, the Battle of the Atlantic would have been lost instantly, regardless of the success at Lorient. The fortress was the final, total expression of the invisible threat, not only protecting the current fleet but guaranteeing the swift mass production of the next, unbeatable fleet. The final Allied gambit. The revelation about Valentine drove the final, desperate Allied strategy. The mission was no longer about infiltration, it was about the largest single-target bombing run of the war. The intelligence confirmed a critical vulnerability. The base was nearly complete but not yet operational. Its massive concrete roof was finished, but the deep industrial foundation and the machinery for the assembly line were not yet fully hardened and protected. The Allies marshaled every available tallboy bomb, now relying entirely on the precision targeting of the RAF's elite 617 inches Dambusters squadron. They couldn't breach the roof, but they could aim for the colossal, unprotected power station adjacent to the fortress or target the massive, newly poured internal dock foundation, hoping the seismic shockwave of the tallboy would rupture the basin and flood the factory floor. The final strike on Valentine became the ultimate, high-stakes moment of the Battle of the Atlantic. The fall of the invisible threat. The operation was carried out in March 1945. The Lancasters, flying low, dropped a torrent of tallboys. The massive bombs did not penetrate the roof, but the seismic shockwave was catastrophic. The explosion breached the basin, causing the river Weser to surge through the factory floor. Crucially, a single tallboy struck the central, unprotected power station, plunging the entire unfinished shipyard into darkness. The base was nearly complete when Allied bombers finally discovered and destroyed it in 1945. The destruction of Valentine was the strategic turning point. It ended the German dream of launching the unbeatable Type 21, which had been the first true modern U-boat. Coupled with the earlier, crippling disruption by Valois at Lorient, the German naval command finally lost its industrial edge. The flow of U-boats prowling the seas finally slowed, ending the cycle where no matter how many submarines they destroyed, more kept coming. The War of Shadows was finally over, won not by a large naval battle, but by the courage of a single agent who breached the invincible and the final, successful application of engineering against the enemy's ultimate symbol of defiance. Commander Alistair Graves remained in the Admiralty War Room in the weeks following the Allied victory, though the red pins on the situation map were finally shrinking. He felt less triumph than exhaustion. The years of statistical paranoia and chasing shadows buried deep had taken a profound toll. His final duty was writing the post-mortem on the intelligence failure, detailing how the enemy had succeeded in creating a strategic blind spot. He concluded that the German genius was not just in their engineering, but in their cynicism, in their willingness to sacrifice entire coastal cities to conceal the true, protected scale of their operations. Graves was offered a promotion, a comfortable desk job overseeing the naval salvage efforts, but he politely declined. The war had been a mathematical puzzle, and now that the equation had been solved, he had no interest in the ensuing bureaucratic arithmetic. He retired quietly, taking up a small cottage on the Cornish coast where the only shipping traffic was the sound of fishing trawlers, far removed from the statistics of war. He never again looked at a nautical chart without tracing the imaginary lines of a possible, subterranean tunnel. Major Jean-Luc Valois, the reluctant hero. Major Jean-Luc Valois, Lou, emerged from the war as a ghost, the ultimate survivor of the War of Shadows. He refused all medals and public recognition. He had carried out his mission for a singular purpose, retribution for his family lost in the bombing of Rouen, a mission of cold engineering necessity. His debrief on the Karaman fortress provided invaluable insight into the sheer audacity of the German construction, cementing the knowledge that such concrete behemoths could only be defeated from within. Valois spent the first few months of peace traveling through the newly liberated regions of the Massif Central, the very area where he had once hunted the Phantom base. He revisited La Fosse Nord, the site of his initial, brilliant miscalculation, and found the submerged, concrete archway leading to the imaginary tunnel. The lock was simply a massive, uncompleted diversion structure, built as a potential future site but abandoned for the more reliable, protected sites in Germany and Norway. The inland hypothesis, though ultimately wrong, had been close enough to the core truth, the German obsession with the subterranean, to justify the pursuit. Valois eventually returned to his academic roots. He did not rebuild his engineering career but chose instead to teach history at a small university. He lectured on the logistics of the war, focusing not on the generals or the ships, but on the unseen infrastructure, the dams, the railways, the subterranean projects, that truly dictated the conflict's outcome. He never spoke of his time inside the fortress, but his lectures on the calculus of concrete were known for their chilling, precise detail. The final, decisive victory over Nazi Germany in May 1945 brought not only relief but a profound sense of shock. The Allied forces, particularly the engineers and intelligence officers, rushed to secure and inspect the infrastructure of the defeated Reich. What they uncovered far exceeded the paranoia of the wartime reports. Commander Alistair Graves, now a civilian consultant, was among the first British officers allowed inside the conquered coastal bunkers. He walked the vast, hollowed-out concrete chambers of Saint-Nazaire, the air still smelling of diesel and burnt metal. What he saw solidified the terrible truth he had only guessed at from London. Allied engineers were stunned by what they found. The bunkers were not simple shelters, they were gigantic, industrialized fortresses designed for perpetual war. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Graves walked through the internal supply tunnels, now clogged with rubble from Major Valois' sabotage, and saw where the 400,000 tons of reinforced concrete had gone. The walls were layers of dense, high aggregate protection, built not to withstand a war, but to outlive it. The most unsettling discovery was the scale of the internal production capacity, the foundries, the welding pits, and the colossal battery charging rooms that explained the Phantom U-boats' temporal immunity. The logistical problem that had driven the Allies to the brink of defeat was solved. The U-boats were sinking Allied convoys faster than they could be replaced because the German repair cycle was faster than the Allied construction cycle, all thanks to these impenetrable, self-sufficient concrete factories. The undemolishable ruins. The end of the war brought a logistical nightmare for the Allies: what to do with these concrete mountains. The decision was made to demolish the most strategically important U-boat fortresses to prevent any future use. The result was a final, stunning act of German defiance. Some bunkers were so strong they couldn't even be demolished. The Allies experimented with successive waves of conventional explosives, and then, months after the surrender, deployed captured German high-yield charges and even American-supplied demolition bombs. The roofs barely cracked. The vast, layered concrete simply absorbed the explosions, shedding dust but maintaining its structural integrity. The cost and effort required to reduce the fortresses to rubble was deemed excessive, unnecessary, and ultimately, impossible with the materials on hand. Graves visited Lorient one last time. He stood on the devastated quay, looking up at the monumental, scarred faces of the Karaman bunkers. To this day, the ruins of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire still stand, a reminder of an empire's obsession with invincibility. They were the architectural legacy of a regime that had planned for eternity, a chilling testament to the scale of strategic defense. The Dark Marvel. The final classification of the Nazi U-boat network revealed the full, terrifying scope of their engineering genius. The secret submarine bases of Nazi Germany were a dark marvel. This marvel included the coastal fortresses Lorient, Saint-Nazaire that were massive and nearly indestructible. The mountain tunnels Norway that provided deep, geographically shielded refueling and repair stations. The unfinished industrial behemoths Valentine which, though destroyed, demonstrated the intent to dominate the next technological age of warfare. The rumored Alpine bases and other subterranean command centers that spoke to an entire military structure attempting to move itself entirely out of sight and reach. Graves realized that the invisible threat was not one base, but an entire, decentralized shadow infrastructure. The German strategy was to disperse vital assets into multiple, heavily protected sites, betting that the Allies could never find, let alone destroy, every single one. The Allies had won by only crippling the most vital centers, not by eliminating the network entirely. The missing ghost. The final, unsettling question lingered long after the armistice. The Allied victory was undeniable. The Allies found victory at sea. The convoy losses fell, the U-boat fleet was scuttled or surrendered, and the supply lines flowed freely. But as intelligence teams sorted through captured blueprints and interrogated high-ranking German personnel, one crucial piece of the puzzle remained maddeningly elusive: the identity and true location of the initial, primary, dedicated ghost base that had begun the mathematics of attrition in 1943. The coastal fortresses and Valentine explained the capacity, but early intelligence, the rapid turnaround times before the fortresses were fully operational, the obscure radio chatter, The fragmented POW testimony still hinted at a single, ultra-secret primary assembly and command center that was abandoned or scuttled before the Allies could reach it. Graves reviewed the final Operation Janus report. The figures still couldn't fully reconcile the peak U-boat numbers of late 1943. There remained a small, persistent logistical ghost, a facility capable of launching an entire, small submarine flotilla into action with absolute secrecy, then vanishing. The truth was that the war had moved too fast. The Allies had found the visible, crucial targets like Lorient and Valentine just in time. But the original base, the true, deep, isolated wellspring of the invisible threat, was sealed, flooded, or expertly camouflaged, its existence forever preserved by the paranoia of its creators. But not the base that made it possible. The legacy of the hidden ports was twofold. First, the towering, indestructible ruins that served as a physical warning, and second, the unsettling silence of the missing ghost base, a final secret that the defeated Reich took to its grave, a lingering question mark over the greatest naval conflict in history. The War of Shadows had ended, but its deepest shadow had never been fully dispelled.